Hello, everyone. We're going to do book 4 today. Sorry I'm a few minutes late. I've been busy reading another book, so actually a good book. Started it yesterday, and I'm like 300 pages in, so I think fastest book I've ever read. Uh, anyway, let's get this over with. There's not going to be any hats today, as I don't think that this particular part of the story has anything special that would require a hat. But Chapter 4, The Last of the Dollar Eye. Rays of sunlight beamed down through the trees at the edge of the small town of Winter Haven. Spring flowers stood tall through the dense grass, displaying a wide variety of colors, each and every one stretching up in response to the sun's warmth. Laughter echoed across the clearing, finding its way to a boy standing at the edge of the forest road, leading into the settlement. Ravion waited patiently, watching over his siblings. His brother and sister played in the distance, paying no attention to the world around them. With a sigh, he felt the weight of his 10 years. Instinctively, he rested his hand on the pommel of the dull short sword hanging from his hip. He couldn't explain why, but he enjoyed fondling the aged weapon. This was the first time he'd been allowed to carry it outside of his training, and it made him feel powerful and slightly untouchable. Glancing over, he checked on the two younger children, recalling the days when he was able to play as they did. Instead, his days were filled with training in the ways of the sword. Any breaks he was allowed involved babysitting the younger two. It wasn't all that bad, though. They gave him time to reflect on his training, though too much reflection grew old too quickly. He admired his sister sitting among a patch of flowers. She split the stems, lacing them together, and making beautiful spring necklaces among other accessories. Despite her innocent appearance, she was naturally gifted in the ways of combat, as all Dollar Eye were. She had an aptitude with daggers unlike any he'd seen before. It wouldn't be long before she'd be required to sacrifice her playtime as he had. Shifting his attention to his brother, he searched the forest edge for the child, just out of his toddler years. The dark green tunic was hard to see among the grass and leaves, but he found him. The child wandered the far edge of the grove beyond the tree line. Ravion recalled the numerous times he'd marched across the grove to reclaim him, each time reminding him to stay in sight. He knew the youngling was testing his limits, wandering off a bit farther than he was supposed to. Though he was true to his nature, he wouldn't be Dollar Eye if he hadn't expressed the desire to explore the world. But he would have to be careful. He didn't understand how easily he could get lost in the forest. Calmly shaking his head, he counted the minutes until he would have to retrieve him again. Returning his thoughts through his training, he pulled the sword from its short leather sheath and stared intently at the blade. It was discolored from age, but held a brilliant, polished surface. He ran his fingers along the edge. It was rolled from years of use without sharpening, if it had ever been sharp in the first place. Several nicks were embedded in the forged iron, marred where it had contacted another blade. Despite its less than ideal condition, he was proud of the simple weapon. He vowed it would be proud of him one day. A familiar sound echoed in the distance. The slightly pointed tip of his ears twitched, catching the noise. Sheathing the blade, he turned and looked towards Winter Haven. Several pillars of smoke billowed up from the wooden structures in the distance. Fear and excitement rushed through him. He'd trained since the day he was able to hold a weapon. If this wasn't the opportunity he needed to prove himself, then he didn't know what would be. He glanced along the path, ensuring the way was clear. It would take some time to get back, but if he ran, he could close the gap in a few minutes. His mind made, he turned toward his sister, watching her run toward him. "Alexandra, something's wrong. Stay here and keep an eye on him." Hearing his words, she froze and turned back to head over toward her flower patch. Glancing over at the youngest of the three, she retook her seat. Ravion turned and ran as fast as he could. In the blink of an eye, he crested the hill and disappeared from the grove. Atop the hill, the sounds of battle were an extremely large battle assaulted his ears. He heard the familiar clink of swords all around him. Smoke rose from the homes and shops. Bright orange flames licked the layered wooden shingles atop the sloped wooden roofs. roofs. They were turning black from the heat, ready to burst into flame. He felt sick to his stomach, like he'd eaten something bad. The only home he'd ever known was under attack. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to feel. Ignoring the pain deep within him, he moved forward, using the outlying buildings for cover. They seemed to be the only ones that weren't ablaze. Several armor-clad figures wielding graceful and well-balanced weapons swarmed the far edge of town. They surrounded the townspeople, cutting them down with ease. He was too far away to make out who they were, but they were clearly winning the fight. He had to get home and find his parents. Drawing his sword, he slowly made his way through town, hoping he could avoid being seen. The tailor shop was just ahead, having suffered minor charring along the siding. It seemed the fire had been put out before it consumed too much. He quickly made his way around the corner and entered. The building was abandoned, everything remaining in its proper place, suggesting the tailor and his family simply left. Ravion grabbed a large patch of tan linen, noting the resemblance in color to that of the dirt roads outside. Throwing them overhead, he tied them off, tied them off and wrapped around him. That's poorly written. Throwing them overhead, he tied them off and wrapped around him to make an oversized robe. It would be too bulky to fight in, but perhaps he could get closer to his home before they saw him. Testing his reaction time to disrobe, he drew his sword. Testing his reaction time to disrobe and draw his sword, he quickly made his way from the shop and turned down the narrow alleyway. He inhaled softly, clearing his mind, the first thing he'd been taught. The vision began to focus and zoom. He was at one with his surroundings. He felt faster, stronger, as if he was connected to the world around him. Making his way from the alley, he spotted the attacking figures. They'd killed nearly everyone and now were checking for survivors. He'd have to make sure they didn't see him. Placing his back against the wall, he stood as still as his body would allow. The tall, slender monsters resembled humans, but their ears were severely pointed. Realization set in. He knew what they were and why they were here. He closed his eyes, attempting to force the story from his mind. His family's origins, and more importantly, their reason for living among the humans wouldn't help him. He understood why the Alfar continued the tradition for so long, but how they had been discovered was beyond him. He felt his focus fading. He couldn't allow that to happen. With another deep, steady breath, he calmed himself and returned his focus. Waiting for the intruders to pass, he slowly, carefully made his way through the village, avoiding those that would kill him for the mistakes of his ancestors. I think I need to read slower, as I'm getting words jumbled up as I try to do it fast, because truthfully I'm not overly fond of this, but we'll keep doing it. Ravion made his way through the streets. His face paled at the sights before him. The dead or dying bodies of the residents littered the ground where they had fallen. The attackers had abandoned them and moved on to another part of town. This was no simple hunt for the last of the Dollar Eye. This was extermination of anyone they met. This was genocide. He turned the corner, looking up towards the house atop the hill. He couldn't see it yet, but he couldn't see signs of fire either. Much of the smoke had settled, leaving the streets foggy and dense. Hopefully the Alfar hadn't bothered taking the hill. His father built their home with the intention of its defense in mind. Anyone attempting to take it by force would undoubtedly suffer heavy losses. He continued up the small hill, spotting the roof of the wooden cabin. To his relief, it remained free of flame. The momentary victory faded to worry with the sounds of battle straight ahead. They grew louder than ever, echoing inside his mind. Several bodies covered in thin yet sturdy leather armor lined the curved road, having fallen during their trek. The fletching of his father's arrows protruded from the numerous bodies. Emotions twisted inside him. Many of the Alfar were lost in the approach, but from the sounds of the continuing battle at the peak, at least a few made it through. He hurried up the hill, assessing the situation. Frozen in the sight, a crowd gathered in front of his home, encircled around a single man. Ravion gasped, seeing his father, his longsword outstretched and ready to attack. The elder Dalarai took in everything and nothing at the same time. Sweat rolled down his forehead, his long golden brown hair pulled into a tail at the back. He stood with his feet a short distance apart, hands placed one above the other, locked around the extended handle of his longsword. He remained still, waiting for something. Several of the Alfar rushed in, striking in perfect unison. Their target proved too skillful to handle one-on-one. If they were to take him down, they'd have to strike as one and overpower him. Ravion watched, frozen in fear. His father was everything. Nothing could best him. But against so many, how could he hope to succeed? His fear settled, watching the group fall before his eyes. Their deaths a mystery to him. He hadn't seen his father move, let alone strike the outnumbering opponents. Another group followed, suffering similar fate. The remaining Alfar closed in on the lone Dalarai. Many of them suffered moderate wounds, but the blood loss hadn't affected their ability yet. They perished as quickly as they approached, leaving just over half a dozen to finish the unharmed but exhausted warrior. Ravion moved closer. The attackers were too busy to worry about him. He kept his eyes forward, but made sure to listen behind him. He couldn't help his father if they were able to sneak up on him. The battle shifted with the thin numbers, leaving large gaps between the Alfar. His gaze darted to a body, unlike the others, lying crumpled just outside the door of his home. His mother's cold, lifeless eyes stared at him. The void of love she'd shown him for so long. A fresh pool of crimson fluid ran in streams down the stone walkway leading to their door. No! Unable to stop himself, he charged towards his father. The elder Dalarai brought his sword up, blocking a potential deadly blow. Roderlin, get your siblings in retreat. Without pause, he spun the blade around and thrust deep into the attacking Alfar's chest. With ease, he redirected back to his neutral stance, ready for the next advance. Ravion came to a stop several steps from his father. Why did he tell him to retreat? I can help. I've been trained for this. He didn't know what to do. He wanted to return to the grove as his father had commanded, but he also wanted to help against so many intruders. He took another step towards his father. Using the distraction to their advantage, the Alfar rushed in, bringing their blades down in all directions. The familiar ring of steel on steel sounded out, echoing into silence. One by one, the Alfar dropped their weapons, joining their brethren in the blood-soaked earth. Ravion stared into his father's eyes, frozen at the sight. The silence was deafening, as if the drums of war were inverted and pounding in his chest. The long space between beats consumed him. His gaze shifted to the blade protruding from his father's chest, a red stain soaked into the cloth, expanding around the wound. Did they use me as a distraction? Why didn't I listen? Is this my fault? He hadn't realized he was continuing towards his father. Stopping a few steps away, he felt the tears trickle down his cheek. The wet streams pouring down his face made him feel numb. The elder Dalarai fell to his knees, helpless to his murderer towering over him. He looked up, pleading to his successor. Trident, please, he coughed, blood spurting from his mouth. Please, spare my son. He's just a boy. I know you're following orders, but allowing a single child to live cannot make much a difference. The Alfar glanced at the boy. He didn't look like much, scrawny and dirty with a dull short sword. One child won't make a difference, but when he ages, with the training he's undoubtedly been given, he'll make a formidable opponent. Not to mention he'll most likely seek revenge for this day. Is it worth having to look over my shoulder for the rest of my life? The Dalarai are near immortal and extremely resourceful. He may not find me for 1,000 years, but one day he will find me. Returning his attention to the dying Dalarai, he made his decision. Don't beg, Marquil. It's unbecoming. Your family has evaded us too long. Standing orders set forth by Emperor Julian declare all Dalarai must die. You know this. A smirk stretched across his face. He was taking joy in his assignment. He placed his booted foot next to the embedded sword, giving a hefty kick. He pulled the blade free and spun around, lowering the razor edge to the correct height. The sword passed through Markeel's neck with little effort, causing a small amount of blood to spray from the wound, splattering across Ravion's face. Ravion watched his father's head roll from his body. It landed hard on the ground, bouncing a little before coming to a stop. His fist clenched in silent rage. He felt his knuckles pop in protest. He could not stand for this. His father, his mother, everyone he'd ever known was dead. They would pay dearly for this. He felt a cool breeze blow across his face. He didn't know why, but it made him remember his training. His father's words echoed in his ears. Clear your mind. A clouded mind makes a reckless combatant. Ravion took a deep but controlled breath, releasing the anger building inside him. Revenge was not the way of his people, nor was justice. His people held balance above all others. The scales had finally tilted in his favor. He forced all that was and was going to be from his mind. The only thing that mattered was this moment, the moment when he would have to kill or be killed. He pushed his thoughts and emotions aside. Lifting his sword, he readied to defend himself. Trident calmly approached the child. He wouldn't be careless. After all, the child was surely trained. He'd never met a Dalarai who wasn't. Stopping outside the reach of the short sword, he aimed to cut the boy down with his first strike. Like a flash of lightning, he struck the blade down, cracking like out I need to do another edition of this book. Some of this shit's just too hard to read. He struck the blade, cracking out like thunder. Ravion brought his training sword up at the exact moment to stop the attack. He didn't know how, but this dull sword acted as if it had a mind of its own. His reflexes responded to their own accord, rescuing him from the sting of the Alfaran blade. Caught off guard, the Alfar took a step back, keeping his sword at the ready. How did he move so fast? Pressing again, he brought the blade down with more strength and speed. Ravion felt his arms react. He brought the training sword up to defend. The weaker metal flexed beneath the force of the attack. He heard it snap, seeing the shattered pieces splinter towards him. He closed his eyes, feeling the jagged shards fly past his face, leaving shallow cuts in his flesh. The blow dislodged his grip, knocking the shattered weapon from his hand. He looked down, spotting the jagged fragments in the dirt beside him. He took a step back, unsure how he was going to survive. Trident smiled. Your kind is nearly extinct. You no longer have the ability to defend yourself, and when I'm finished, the Dalarai will be nothing more than a distant memory. Ravion stood defiantly against the Alfar. He had to survive. He had to find his siblings and make sure they grew up. A clouded mind makes a reckless combatant. The words echoed in his head a second time, as if his father watched over him, guiding him in this fight. Your task is for naught. You've spent your life in pursuit of my kind. I may not have been around when your emperor gave this order, but I will not stand by while you commit genocide. I promise you I'll survive. And I'll find my people, and when that day comes, we'll rise from the ashes and remove any trace of this outdated and idiotic order from both our histories. I don't know why you wish us dead, but I'll find out. I'm just sad your emperor will be long dead before that day comes. He took a step closer to the Alfar, purposely placing himself within his attacker's reach. Trident felt his blood boil with the defiant child's words. Unfortunately, he was too close to effectively cut him down. He could not allow the words to go against his emperor to go unpunished. Bringing his gauntleted fist down, he caught the child across the cheek. The impact launched Ravion from his feet. He felt the impression of the hardened leather across his face. For the briefest moment he was weightless, flying through the air. His face hurt, but it had to feel better than a sword cutting into him. He collided with something hard but forgiving, forcing the air from his lungs. Panic rushed through him, causing him to spasm where he lay. Focused on his task, he calmed himself, controlling his breathing. Looking around, he found a pile of Alfaran bodies beneath him. Rolling from the mound of death, he searched for anything that would help him. The sight of his father's body drew him in. His gaze locked on the longsword lying in the dirt inches from his hand. Climbing to his hands and knees, he looked around, locating his attacker. Trident was just over 15 steps away, whereas the sword was just out of reach. Ravion smiled. He had plenty of time to get the blade before the Alfar would be upon him again. He launched forward and grabbed the sword, continuing around. He rolled to his feet, standing with the sword in hand. The Alfar smirked, making his way toward the armored child. Ravion took a defensive stance, lifting the surprisingly light weapon. It weighed barely half what his training sword did. Raising the blade, he prepared for the next assault. A single heartbeat felt like a lifetime. Watching the Alfar tower over him, as before, he reacted with pure instinct, deflecting the multiple blows raining down upon him. He felt a bit of joy watching his attacker struggle. He didn't have much of a plan, but this was working. Each unsuccessful strike granted him more time for his next action. Sweat poured from the exhausted Alfar, swinging wildly trying to get past the young Dollarized defenses. Unable to find weakness in the miniature form, he was rapidly growing tired. Ravion felt his strength growing. Even the sweat he felt clinging to his skin had faded. He took a deep breath, allowing the calm to flow through him. He was connected to everything and nothing, like a bystander watching his own body, witnessing the world around him with superior knowledge of its events. The entire battle quickly played out before him. He watched in shock, reliving his father's death. Only this time his emotions remained in check. He reviewed everything up to his current point, but it didn't stop there. The battle was moving forward, revealing details that hadn't yet come to pass. The vision, as best he could figure, played to its conclusion. He knew he was still fighting, and judging by the fact that he hadn't felt any pain, he was still alive. Feeling himself sink back into his body, he deflected a quick jab from the towering Alfar, as his vision had revealed. Each action played out exactly as seen. The precise moment was coming fast. Trident swung hard, overextending himself. Ravion watched the opening present a perfect target, just as he'd seen. Using the opportunity, he thrust the longsword straight up into the leather plates. The blade sank deep with minor resistance. Surely he'd pierced a vital organ. Twisting the blade slightly, he was rewarded with blood, running down the polished steel, showering him in the crimson life fluid. The Alfar fell to his knees before the young Dollarai, his blood steadily pumping from the lethal wound. Ravion pulled the sword free, taking a step back to keep from being crushed by the larger opponent. Trident stared curiously at the child before him. How could a child not only hold me off, but defeat me? Unable to take another breath, he fell to the unforgiving ground, his blood pooling beneath him. Ravion watched the life fade away from the Alfar's dulling eyes. He stood victor over the Alfar responsible for his father's death. He watched the life leave his enemy, feeling no remorse nor pride in what he'd done. It was simply something that had to happen, and he was destined to accomplish it. Hours passed, leaving the fading sun a soft glow on the horizon. Several fires burned brightly, illuminating the barren streets. Ravion knelt down beside the forest road, studying the tracks. There were clearly fresh hoofprints, but that didn't explain where his siblings were. The Alfar didn't have horses, so it was unlikely they went to Eastwood. "Alexandra, where are you?" His question was answered by silence. He felt the pain of losing his parents begin to grow within him, and now his siblings were missing. He searched the grove for what had to have been the 100th time. The flowers still lay there, trampled and wilting. A few drops of dried blood rested on the stems and petals, but nothing but not enough to suggest serious injury. Large booted footprints covered the area in all directions, but they clearly came from town. Nobody suggested they returned with captives, or nothing suggested they had returned with captives. Even if he knew who else had been here, the tracks were too numerous to locate a single set. He glanced up at the final slither of sunlight disappearing behind the trees. "It's time," he admitted, knowing no one was around to hear his words. He pulled a small stone from the pouch and he pulled a small stone from the pouch strapped to his side. Securing the torch he'd brought with him, he quickly struck the flint rock against his father's sword. The sparks danced to life, finding refuge in the oil-soaked rag. It flared to life, illuminating the area. He raised it overhead and waved it back and forth, signaling the others. A group of just over a dozen children, the oldest one looking to be a few years younger than Ravion, approached, carrying what few belongings they could manage, wrapped up in blankets and old packs. They stopped in front of him, awaiting orders. "The path seems clear. If you walk all night, you should be able to reach Eastwood by midday. Tell the guards what happened, and they'll make sure you're taken care of. Joshua, Karin, take these." He handed two of the dull training swords to the oldest of the group. "Hopefully you won't need them, but it's better than nothing." Don't split up, and don't leave the road. Take the torch. If you have to stop for the night, use it to make a fire off the road. You don't want to draw unwanted attention, but you also don't want to be caught unaware in the dark either. Good luck. The small group set out, disappearing into the shadows of night. Ravion watched their light shrink in the distance. He couldn't help but wonder if his siblings had already headed that way. Returning to town, he wondered if the children would make it to Eastwood. Short of going along, he'd given them the best opportunity to survive. It was on them now. It's for the best. They weren't in any condition to assist me. With a heavy sigh, he lit another torch and tossed it into a pile of straw he layered inside the tailor shop. The fire flared to life, quickly spreading to the walls and ceiling. Within moments, it encompassed the bodies within. He watched their flesh char through the inflamed doorway. It was a burden no child should have to bear, but he was the only one to carry it. The children didn't need to face this with him. They'd seen enough already. Their homes were gone. The best he could offer them was a chance at survival. Hiding his exposed flesh from the heat, he struck another torch into the flame, carrying it to another building. He tossed it in, letting the flame engulf the wooden structure in a matter of minutes. That caught me off guard. I didn't saw the little light there fly across my face. They carried it to another building. He tossed it in, letting the flames engulf the wooden structures in a matter of minutes. The Alfaran bodies piled inside didn't deserve to be laid the rest with their victims. It had taken the better part of the day to sort and pile them, but it was the right thing to do. Nearly everything he could find to burn was piled with them. It would take a great amount of heat to properly dispose of them, but the fires would be seen for miles, but it was better than leaving them to rot in the streets. Leaving them to be consumed by the flames, he returned to the cabin atop the hill. His parents were wrapped in several layers of cloth and laid to rest peacefully in their beds. It wasn't quite according to tradition, but it would have to suffice. The once beautiful village of Winterhaven was now barren and dark. The moonlight made the blood-soaked streets glow, and the numerous pyres coated the ruined village in ash. I don't know about that. I think Morgan Freeman's got a slightly more charismatic voice than I do. Although I could start talking about Andy Dufresne. Grabbing his father's backpack, he tossed a few sets of clothes into the bottom. It would have to be arranged, but first he needed to load up. A slightly larger pair of boots were tied to the side. It would give him something to grow into. He rolled a thick woolen blanket up inside his bedroll and strapped it to the bottom of the bag to save room. Searching every room in the house, he grabbed anything he thought he might need. The bag nearly overflowed. He continued packing. His father's whetstone fit perfectly into the side pocket along with the flint Pulling the drawstring taut, he tossed it over his shoulder and made for his parents' room for his final inspection. I can sometimes agree with that. I think it also depends on how much alcohol the viewers had. Thank you both for teaching me the value of life and the responsibility of death. I'll uphold the traditions of our people as best I can and honor the balance entrusted to me by my birthright. If I can find our people, I'll do my part to lead us into a new era. He placed a silver coin over each of his parents' eyes and turned to leave the room, snatching his father's belt and sheath on the way out. It was much too large for him, but with a few simple modifications it would fit. Loading his father's leather tools, he quickly sized the belt and tossed the smaller tools into his pack. Sheathing the sword, he tested the draw. It was a bit too long to do smoothly, but he would grow into it. The last things he needed were food and coin. It would take some time before he could make either on his own. Stepping from the common room, he pulled a chair over the hearth and climbed up. The small chest resting atop the wide ledge was filled to the brim with gold, silver, and gems. Provided he could manage it properly, he shouldn't have to worry about funds for at least a few years. He stuffed the last bits of dried meat and fruit into his bag and double-checked everything, making sure he hadn't missed anything. Time was upon him. It would be daylight soon, and he needed to get on the road. Hopefully Alexandra and Demetrius would be waiting for him in Eastwood. Reaching the door, he grabbed the oil lamp resting on the corner table. With a final look around, he memorized every detail. He'd never see it again, and such a memory would keep him going. Sighing deeply, he threw the lantern as hard as he could. It shattered, sending flaming oil out over the floor. The cedar shingles were ablaze in moments, burning away his past. Ravion turned and marched toward the forest road, ready to face what tomorrow held. He didn't know where he was going, but if his family was still alive, it was his duty to find them. It was a large world, and he needed to search as much of it as possible. If nothing else, maybe he could find and reunite the remaining Dollar Eye. His people needed to be led into a new age, and maybe he would be the one to guide them. The sun was beginning to set over the high mountain peaks. Flakes of white blew all around, landing comfortably on the sleet-covered ground. A few trees stood, waving in the breeze of the cool evening air. Among the rocky peaks and thin trees stood a man, young in appearance, but with an aged sense about him. Over 200 years had passed since the child set out from the burning home in search of the world in hopes of finding anything that would unlock the secrets of his people. Over 200 years of journeys and quest in exchange for information. 200 years of puzzles, all leading him to this one place. He stood at the mountain peaks looking into the wild. The frozen specks clung to his face, landing in stark contrast to his black cloak and navy blue garments. The sight before him filling his mind, he stared into the distance, feeling the snow and wind surround him. Pulling his cloak tight around his thin frame, he squinted out at the world below. Several kingdoms rested as far as the eye could see, each one holding secrets of their own. A long wall stretched across the land, sealing the northern lands from the south with a single outpost in the center. He couldn't help but feel helpless at the sight of the land stretching as far as he could. That's a little repetitive there, I think. Anyway. But the rumors and information he gathered sent him here, to the birthplace of the Druafar, to the ancient lands of his people before they made their mistake. Ravion held the cloak tight, locking the chilling wind out. He took his first steps into Dalmora, making sure his foot was secure in the snow-covered peaks. Again he stepped, each time moving closer to possible answers. His feet firm against the sloping, dangerous grounds, he walked carefully, making his way into the strange new lands. Near the base of the large mountain range, he came across the weather-worn sign planted firmly in the dirt beside the winding mountain road. Trees and goals, 60 miles, he read aloud, wondering how long it would take him to reach the unknown city. And that is the end of Chapter 4. I believe next Sunday we will do Chapter 5. And I've got a blog post scheduled to release tomorrow. Should be around 1 p.m. Central. Order of the Trident 2. I've been receiving regular reports from the editor. It's coming along nicely. So we're going to have that ready for VisionCon. I'm also hosting a panel at VisionCon, so hopefully we'll see you guys there. And I'm working on getting the audiobook done for Chapter 1. I'm sure that I've heard reports of the guy that I've got reading that, and he does a little bit better job than I do in these. So it ought to be a nice product when it's all said and done. Order of the Trident 3, I've decided to move my release date on that one up a little bit. So I'm currently working on that and that other book that I have talked a little bit about. So I'll be having 2 more books out very soon that I'm working on right now. And then I don't know when we're going to officially release Where Rats Tell 4, but I've sent that one to Shane Moore, and hopefully we'll see something from that pretty soon. Anyway, you guys have been great. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to talking to you again next time. Bye.